Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me for another edition of the show. A couple weeks ago, we had a little conversation about the NFL, about AI, and where all of this was heading. And it's something that more and more sports leagues are looking to adapt, whether it's in the way that they interact with highlights like the NBA is doing, or in the case of the NFL for strategy and data collection and that sort of thing. And it seems that with the integration of more and more tech companies into these leagues, we're getting more involved in AI in sports. And it led me to my next guest, who is at the forefront of AI and innovation in that field in the tech space, is Tyler Hochman, who is the CEO and founder of FORE Enterprises. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Omar. I'm doing great and appreciate the pun about FORE Enterprise being at the forefront.
Yeah. Well, we try to be clever over here, Tyler. So, for those who aren't familiar, if you could just kind of give us a little bit of a rundown of your background, how you got into AI, and what FORE Enterprises is exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my entrepreneurial journey and kind of discovery into AI at Stanford University, where I studied a number of different kinds of engineerings until I eventually graduated in functionally industrial engineering. And at the time, obviously AI has been ripe for a while, but it was definitely a focus of the university and of mine there. I started a different company in consumer technology while at Stanford, and then a quantitative analytics firm, and a couple different things until about 3, 4 years ago when I started Four. And since then, it's definitely been a very cool journey because AI has taken off. The way businesses use AI is taking off. And as a result of that, we didn't start in the sports space, but transitioned into it, and it's been, a great space for us.
So, what made you want to transition into the sports space? What did you see that you said, you know what, this is a growth market for us, it's an opportunity for us to kind of expand?
Yeah, so Four, really focuses on building what we call AI pipelines. And it's essentially everything from how do you actually ingest data, player data, team data, facility data, health data, where do those data sources come from? And then how do you structure and format that data, store that data to then output it into really cool tools that players and teams and coaches and front office and back office are all using. And it really is, from that perspective, just like any of the other Fortune 500 businesses we work with, the use case is whether or not it's a financial analyst at a large bank or it's a sports analyst, they may use AI similarly. And so it was a natural transition for us.
The NFL, they kind of really leveraged their partnership with Microsoft lately when it comes to their AI solutions. Obviously, Microsoft fully ingrained into the AI space when that is what their future looks like over the next decade. And they've kind of positioned it as like, all right, here's this Microsoft stack of all these solutions and services. Here's GitHub, here's our different co-pilots, here's all this stuff that we can use as data for. NFL front office, NFL coach are going to be able to use that to figure out play design, to figure out situational rotations and lineups and that sort of thing. It's a very data driven way to using AI. And do you think that when it comes to the world of sports, that's going to be the way forward into just leveraging data into helping you make better decisions? Is that kind of the path that makes sense for sports here when it comes to AI?
Yeah, I think sports has always had a quantitative and qualitative focus. There's a couple great examples of that. There's great movies about it. Kind of the best movie that demonstrated the use of analytics early on, right, is like Moneyball is one of my favorites in the MLB. What AI has enabled us to do is bridge the gap between those who are quantitatively very sophisticated and those who are qualitatively inclined. And so you can now generate, potential you can generate similar insights, if not better insights using AI, but then the way you communicate those insights with the front office, the back office, the coaching staff, and then subsequently even the players themselves, AI has definitely transformed that as well.
The example I always went to, I wrote a piece about the NFL's implementation was, and in a very simple term, if you have a wide receiver And when he's lined up outside, let's say his success rate is 70%. But when he's lined up inside, it bumps to 85%. And if you get that data as a coach, then you're just like, oh, I need to line this guy up inside more. So you could argue that this data is helping teams and coaches and players even become just smarter tactically. And in a way, it also kind of leads into just kind of the specialization of certain players and positions. And I would argue that's a good thing. Do you think that that sort of specialization and that sort of marriage to data is a good thing for the end product of a sport?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the ability to use analytics to, maximize the efficiency of players in really any position, whether it be a wide receiver, a running back, an offensive lineman, a defensive lineman, really any position on the field is 100% a value add. And you can even argue from the perspective of like injury risk. There's a lot of different stuff going on about incorporating health information that has historically been very data driven, but also very technical into an ability for a player or a coach to understand how to actually make actionable insights on that. I think where AI has gone interesting and the analytics side of it is kind of always existed. I mean, it's relatively new to the lifetime of the sport, but over the last, 20, 10 years, it's been around. I think what AI has made it interesting is like, could you create a chat bot, essentially your chat GPT that would be trained on the data of that team and then allow a coach to actually ask that question, right? Because previously they have to go to their analyst, the analyst pulls up the data, they try to explain the data to them in a non-technical way. Now, with proper chatbots, as an example, a coach could ask, "Okay, what are my red flags, right? Or like, what are my inefficiencies that I'm seeing on the wide receiver position or this specific player, and ways that they're running routes that aren't necessarily the most optimally efficient." And then it'll speak with them, and they can dialogue with it. And so it's definitely bridging that accessibility gap between the quantitative and the qualitative for sure.
You could kind of argue that that goes from a game planning thing, game to game, week to week, whatever, into an on the fly adjustment. Because if you, like you said, you're using a chatbot, then you're able to just say, "Hey, what are we seeing here? This is what I think the tendency is, and in this situation, what has been successful, hasn't been successful," and then you can make an adjustment on the fly. Again, it just leads to smarter tactical play, which I think is a net win for everybody. You mentioned chatbots, which is kind of the next point. That's how I know you're a good guest, Tyler. You can just lead me into my next point naturally. When you go to an average sports fan and you talk to them about AI, chances are they're going to start talking about chatbot, but they're probably going to think of a Chat GPT or a Google Gemini or a Microsoft Copilot, whatever. And they think of it as asking you the question, it got to go spitting out an answer. So they might think of it generating images, and that is obviously a utility, but probably more of a baseline when you think about the capability of AI. So, from your perspective, as leagues and teams and players and health professionals starts to incorporate AI more, where is the potential here? Like, what is the max potential of this in terms of how it can change the way that sports operate?
It's a great question. So I think on the basis, right, things AI do that a lot of people understand really well, right? It summarizes information really well. And so it's taking the analytics we already know, it's summarizing it, and then it's outputting it in such a way, but it's outputting it in such a way where it's easily digestible. And I think people have a lot of experience in seeing that be done well. And that's when they're using ChatGPT, and that's where they're using a variety of Copilot or Google Gemini, where, and that's kind of the base use case. And I think one though that is very important, right? One that didn't exist. Subsequently, a slight advanced version of that is the actual structuring and formatting of that data, right? That it's taking what we call like dispersed data, right? Data that's coming from a bunch of different sources. So you have your health information, you have time stamped relative to the plays in the game, relative to the coaching signals that are being given. And it's essentially organizing all that information so you can actually form a more coherent picture. And I think that's one that people can kind of resonate with. Where AI gets very interesting is, can AI determine, and let's use play calling as an example, optimal plays in real time, potentially even better than a human being, right? Because it can synthesize large amounts of information at a way that a human brain or multiple human brains could never really execute before, and then tangents off that. And so it's functioning its ability to forecast and predict. And I think it does get very interesting there. That being said, is it there yet? I personally don't think so. I think it's doing the summarization of large data very well right now in terms of the ability to predict and forecast. It's getting there, but right now it because of that serves as a very helpful and it's aptly named by Microsoft a co-pilot.
So I had a conversation recently with somebody who's involved with a league in the capacity as an agent. And he was kind of talking to me about AI as well. And it's something he was looking into in the lens of some teams are embracing it, other teams aren't. In the NFL, the Rams and the Buccaneers are all in on this, right? And not coincidentally, they're two of the smarter run organizations over the last 5 years, you would argue. And he would say that if you're a team that has a disadvantage, whether it be from a taxation aspect because of your location versus a team in, say, Florida or Texas that doesn't have that problem, or you have a undesirable market, whatever the case may be, you can position your use of AI as, hey, we're the smarter team. It's almost like the Moneyball Oakland A's example,
It's a great
where,
example.
yeah, where we're a small market, don't have a huge payroll, but we can win on the margins, right? And are we heading to a point here where the teams that have those disadvantages, this is kind of a great equalizer for them in being able to compete with your more desirable teams or bigger market teams, so to say?
Yeah, I mean, on face, I like to say it democratizes education, right? It's
Mhm.
providing a lower cost basis towards being able to access advanced analytics functioning, whether it be play calling or scouting or analysis in general. And I definitely do believe it equalizes it. Where it gets interesting is when it first comes out. I think it's an equalizing factor, and I think but eventually it just raises the bar, right? It raises what the baseline looks like, and the baseline will soon be that everyone's going to need to use it. Can you still generate what in the financial world people would describe as alpha? Can you essentially be your arbitrage by having AI specialists, let's say, and then that's why you see the Metas and the Google, they're overpaying right now for AI talent
Mhm.
that can actually train better out. Like if you're comparing, let's say, the Raiders algorithm or LLM to the Rams, will there be a difference? Absolutely, there will be. And it's actually what our business focuses on is that we can create essentially AI agents for point solutions. So for very specific things. So I even think we'll get to the place where the AI agent that better instructs a wide receiver will not only look different from team to team, but it's going to look different from position to position. There will be competitiveness even on that field. So right now, I believe it's providing a more equal baseline for everyone. But as it advances, it's going to be another place that people compete on 100%.
So you talked about agents, which I think is the buzzword in the AI world right now. Everybody who has any sort of chatbot or any sort of software that's consumer facing is talking about agents. Copilot has done it. I'm a Notion user. Notion just rolled out agents this past week. So are we heading in a way where, like I said, it's just like it's not just going to be this all-knowing figure, right? Where it's just gonna be, "Here's your yard maximization agent, here's your route running agent, here's your pass protection agent," whatever. And that way it allows for just this deep level of specialization when it comes to just maximizing output when with every single position group, every single type of player. I mean, if you wanna get really granular, you typically have had different types of archetypes for different positions, like using a running back as an example, you would have a power back who runs north and south, or you would have a more elusive back who goes side to side, and the different ages for those different type of archetypes. Is that kind of where you think we might be heading?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason we shouldn't be heading there. I think in terms of, and I think the best example of that, right, is just the way that it's done without AI right now is that you've got not only player specializations, coach specializations, scout specializations, and AI theoretically is just going to replicate those positions and jobs to a higher degree, right? To a degree that can now synthesize the information that would previously take one or multiple people multiple hours in seconds. And I absolutely believe that, I don't know when it'll be, but we will see in at least in the next couple decades or so, a team that is represented by players, but also represented by agents. And it's going to be agent to agent communication. It is going to be the coolest thing. And like you may even trade agents. Like it may get crazy, like a meta level of AI expression.
So I want to talk a little bit about pushback that this might receive. And you had like go back to the dawn of analytics really about 20 years ago. And we've seen it in the NBA, a lot of pushback on this from people who watch the game. There's where people are for so long were so reliant on the eye test and having situational awareness and that sort of thing. Basically the stuff that humans are really good at. We see it in excessive fourth down attempts in the NFL, seen it in 3-point shooting volume in the NBA. But there's some pushback where a lot of people were like, well, I don't really like the idea of my favorite sport being reduced to a math problem. I've written about this kind of dynamic before where it's just like the numbers and the math help, but there is still an artistry to sports as well. So moving forward, are we leaning more towards the math and leaving that more abstract athletic greatness thing that's tangible when you see it, but you can't really measure as much? Are we kind of leaving that behind, or is there a world where they coexist on some level?
I definitely think they will coexist, in perpetuity. As a great example that I joke around with all the time, I've got a 11-month-old son. I'm roughly 5'9.5" on a good day. My wife is 5'2". There will only be so much maximization of my son's ability relative to his physical talents that will allow him to first certain sports maybe especially at a professional level just off the table. And I
Right.
think given that size and height, you can kind of guess which ones. So there's that element of it, which is, I think, even with the best driven analytics, the human talent component of it is you can't go away with it. Like it will never go anywhere. There's only so many limitations that AI, so many ways you can maximize efficiency. Now, will it help us maximize efficiency? 100%. Is it very good at doing things on average? It's incredible, right? And that's why, to your point, like in the NBA with 3-point shot attempts, on average, it's showing that teams have more success when they shoot more threes. That being said, there are still multiple teams in the league that are not designed to shoot a lot of threes. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to lose. It actually doesn't. I mean, we've seen now some championships. Now, granted, you still have big men that have now learned to shoot a three, so the bar has been raised. I was talking about earlier, like the foundational bar, I think, is just getting better and better. And like using even a sport like tennis as an example, and because I love it as an example because a lot of the greats, the Pete Sampras, John McEnroe, who you hear announcing all the time, they talk about like if you even Roger Federer, if you put them in the modern tennis environment, they just wouldn't. It would be a different. They're almost playing a different sport, right? Like the racket technology, the endurance training, it's gotten the level has gotten so high. That being said, there is still such a human component to that, and being able to, be the best and the greatest. And so I think it's always going to be a balancing act. And then, in classic sports fashion, there's going to be like what we call a meta, right? There's going to be the way the sport changes, then there's going to be a way you counter that change, knowing that's the way everything's changed. Like right now, we see in the NBA the uptick of 3-point shots. At some point, there's going to be a new defensive strategy that requires, and they're already executing it. They keep man-to-man playing and keeping everyone on the perimeter and allowing them to come in with a single big man, and the big man just reduces the number of layup attempts, and ultimately it works, right? And so there's moves and counter moves, and that's what we're seeing right now.
I'm a firm believer that a lot of people are just resistant to change, right? And, it's like with the 3-point shot, that's been kind of really been maligned by a lot of fans. But at the same time, in football, we've seen a change in the way quarterback is scouted, where 15 years ago, you wanted that Tom Brady, Peyton Manning style to sit there in the pocket and analyze. Now, if you can't have a little bit of mobility, at least, you're kind of DOA, right? In terms of the NFL, that's because well, I have another option here. I have another avenue to gain yards. If the pass isn't there, I can run for it. And that is kind of the evolution of the game there. And that's been more embraced, which is kind of interesting. The How the fan is so fickle when it comes to a change in the way things are going. Like in basketball, players have never been more efficient, and big men have never been more skilled. Really, when you think about what they could do, they could still do things inside. It's not like they can't. They just, two is less than three, so you got to learn how to make the three, right? And that's kind of the interesting dynamic. I think there's going to be pushback regardless because people don't like change. Anytime baseball has made a change in the recent years, people have been up in arms about it, but eventually they adjust and adapt, and the athletes get better, and the product typically gets better. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, the progress is forward. And like you said, the older eras, it's why I hate era comparisons so much. Like, let me appreciate what the '90s Knicks were, while fully understanding they would win maybe 10 games in the modern NBA because they can't shoot, right? So, it's different things. One thing I do find interesting as well, Tyler, is obviously, you're in the AI space. I've been pretty familiarized with it as well, and we both, I think, see the advantages, and we talked a lot about those advantages so far. However, there are concerns going on right now where there's the environmental concerns, right, of servers and with water and cooling down servers and that sort of thing. There's also kind of the degradation of the human mind that a lot of people have fears about, and so there's a lot of good and positive with AI, but there's also a fair amount of concern and angst I think that people have. So, do you think that that's going to scare off teams and leagues if the public perception of AI isn't as pristine as maybe we would like it to be?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I like to think about the example, just going back to our Moneyball
Mhm.
example, the pushback that the Oakland A's faced until they actually demonstrated success. I mean, in those early days, everyone looked at them and they're like, this team is insane. Like, what is even happening? And so I do think one, that success breeds satisfaction, right? And so we are seeing limited versions of that success, and as a result of that, people are embracing it more and more. That being said, I think AI is a tool, and like any tool, can be used positively or negatively. But what I would say to the fan is remain skeptical. Like, the way this gets better is with that skepticism. It's what pushes the boundaries of what's possible. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being highly skeptical and doubting the efficacy and efficiency of its ability. And that's what is going to make it better. Like, if everyone just accepted it right now, I actually don't think it's going to get as good as it will be in the next 5 to 10 years, because it is having to overcome those limitations. From the environmental side, you're seeing radical new technologies in the way that we generate energy and the way that we cool down servers, because they're upset about it, and they should be. And as a result of that, it's actually pushing our boundaries of what's possible. I think it's going to be the exact same thing in basketball, in football, in baseball, in tennis, in all these different sports, because they are challenging the notions of what is possible. And to your Knicks example, not only is it the game has changed, but also the physicality and the level of physicalness is the wrong word, but like the literal metrics of what make up a person. Now, if
Mm.
you look at like physical metrics, from muscle mass to height to all these different things, technology has allowed us to push those further and further and further and further than we ever thought was possible, while remaining extremely skeptical of that process. And the final thing I want to say, which is tangential to this, is I actually believe that what's going to become even more important is the league management, and it's something that I think is maybe talked about, but not will become more talked about as technology becomes and AI becomes more and more prominent. Because ultimately, what AI does is optimizes for a rule set, right? Like, an NBA is the greatest example. Like, it's the fact that a three is more than a two. Now, that may not always be the case. I mean, there's been a ton of different conversations around there. And then once those rules change, it's got to start from scratch again. And so I do think it makes it the most efficient relative to what the rules are, but it is on league management to realize that if the experience itself is being changed in a way they never imagined, because they never could conceptualize how AI could affect it, or maximizing efficiency with technology could affect it, they may very well just change the way the game is played.
Your point about being challenged and having to accommodate the criticism is a really good one. It reminds me, you've seen it a lot throughout the history of tech. I think like Intel, I think is a good example of this, where they were the 95% market share holder when semiconductors for forever. All of a sudden, AMD and Qualcomm start entering the space, and like, oh, well, we gotta step it up here, and they've started to do that. And you think about Microsoft Office was the market leader for ever. And then Google Docs comes around and they're like, hold on, we got to make this a little bit more nimble. Right. And without that kind of pushback, you're never going to innovate, right? You're never going to make it better. We talked a little bit about kind of the future here. And I guess to kind of close out this conversation, Tyler, ideally for somebody like you who's on the ground in AI, is what does the relationship between AI and the sports world at large look like in a utopian world in the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, in an idealized version, and it depends. it, it's interesting, right? Because if you're a fan of a team, your goal or a player, your goal is always to make that team better, right? Or that player better. The question is, if you're a fan of a sport, is it necessarily by creating such large differences in team performance, is it necessarily making the sport better? And so I do think in a utopian world, there's true access to AI. There's true access to AI, and everyone gets almost an equal playing field when they're approaching AI and the ability to train these agents to, for different positions and different shooting styles or different passing lanes and so on and so forth. That is my utopian idea. It really does function as a great co-pilot where it's going to allow a small market team without a lot of resources to be able to have a scouting department of 1,000 in conception, right? But it's just one agent. And now it can cover so many more players or so much up and coming talent that it was never able to cover before. And this team would never otherwise be able to do it. That is my utopian idea. In actuality, do I think it's going to raise the bar for everyone? 100%. Do I think the big market teams are still going to get better access to AI resources? They are. So it's going to be a harmonized. We're going to have to push back and forth there to make sure that it truly is making it more democratized for all sports.
You brought up a point that made me think a little bit about college football. And in college football, I think there's been this huge separation between the Big Ten and the SEC and everybody else. And they're going to get better talent. They're going to pay more. They're going to be able to maximize so much more that all these other schools can't. So in a sense, that middle class of smaller school that has a really good coaching staff or whatever that used to be able to compete, maybe not so much anymore. And I wonder if we talked about democratization, if you're like Florida Atlantic, you gotta compete for recruits against Miami and Florida State and Florida and South Florida, all these schools that have more resources than you do. And I wonder if that becomes an avenue for them to say, okay, how can we maximize on this 2 or 3 star guy that we're going to be able to get so that we put him in positions when we're up in Tallahassee playing that 5 star DB that he's going to be able to win. Right. And I do wonder if that becomes an avenue. And but then of course it opens it up to, well, what happens when the big school gets its hands on that, right? So it's, I guess, would you say that that's an avenue, or is it a situation where because the big school has more spend, they're just gonna allocate all their funds into that and then just create an even wider gap?
Well, what I can say right now is they're not. So there's a first mover advantage here. I mean, don't get me wrong. A lot of the big schools or big market teams are doing this, but there's a handful that aren't. And so if I was part of a smaller market or a smaller team, I 100% would be doubling down on this because there will be enough of a gap that even may allow what analytics were to the A's and put them in the playoffs when they really necessarily from a market cap perspective did not have any business being there. Is there will be a time frame here where like you can take advantage of this and you can reap a lot of rewards. Are the big guys going to catch up? I mean, they often do. I don't really see an instance where they haven't. That being said, they aren't. Some of them are, some of them aren't right now, and I would be doubling down on it for sure if I'm a small market team.
Yeah, like, I think about, it's almost like when the spread offense was introduced in college, right? Like, your Michigans and Georgias and whatever, they were kind of stuck in this pro style thing of, "This is what gets the recruits, this is what keeps us successful," and then all of a sudden, you get a team that's, like, throws out 5 wide receivers, and they don't know what hit them, and, it seems like a similar type of dynamic where It's like, all right, where can we kind of really exploit weaknesses? And, there is no perfect team. So every team is going to have a weakness. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting way to do it. I would be curious to see, it really interests me on the college level, but just because to see if a smaller school will try to exploit that in addition to baseball, I think is probably your next closest thing to that. How do the Pittsburgh Pirates maximize, right? When they're trying to go up against the Yankees and the Dodgers and those sort of teams. So it's a very interesting discussion. And Tyler, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this. It's an awesome conversation. I really did enjoy it.
No, thank you for having me on. I mean, this is definitely one of the coolest applications of AI. Our media team often tells me that when I explain what we do, it's somewhat dense and not that exciting. So I'm glad I got to share the more fun side of it.
Well, yeah, every company has that, right? Where they have their cool stuff that everybody wants to talk about, but then the less mundane stuff that needs to be going at an operational level to keep things moving. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody, if you are in the AI space, make sure to check out his company, FORE Enterprises, and I'll have their website in the description here so you can check them out. Thank you as always for tuning in to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zoran. Thanks for joining me for another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast.